Have you ever witnessed an act of cruelty so shocking that it made your blood boil? Imagine seeing someone deliberately knock down a blind veteran who's just trying to cross the street. Now imagine what might happen if that veteran's military brothers and sisters were just around the corner. Stay with me, because what unfolded next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. Welcome to Honor Echoes, where we bring you real stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between those who've served. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to hear more powerful stories about veterans who've changed lives and communities across America. Now, let me tell you about an incident I witnessed that shows exactly why you never mess with someone who served our country. It was an unusually warm spring day in downtown Fayetteville, North Carolina, a city practically in the shadow of Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world. The streets were busy with the usual mix of civilians and military personnel that you'd expect in a military town. I was sitting at an outdoor cafe, enjoying my lunch break and people watching, something I do whenever I need inspiration for my writing. That's when I noticed him, an elderly man with dark glasses and a white cane, carefully making his way toward the crosswalk about 20 yards from where I sat. Even from a distance, I could tell he was a veteran. It wasn't just the camo print baseball cap with Vietnam veteran embroidered across the front, or the military posture that he still maintained despite his age. There was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity mixed with caution as he navigated the busy sidewalk. His name, I would later learn, was Thomas Reeves. Master Sergeant Thomas Reeves, retired. A decorated Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and lost his sight not in combat, but years later due to a rare complication from Agent Orange exposure. The doctors had told him it would be gradual, but nothing could prepare him for the darkness that eventually consumed his world. But Thomas wasn't the type to let blindness stop him from living independently. After years of rehabilitation and training with his service dog, a black Labrador named Scout, who had unfortunately passed away just a month prior, he had mastered the art of urban navigation with his white cane. He knew this particular crossing well, having walked this route to the VA clinic hundreds of times over the years. As Thomas approached the crosswalk, he stopped at the edge, listening intently for the distinctive chirping sound that would signal it was safe to cross. His cane extended in front of him, tapping the ground methodically as he prepared to step off the curb. What happened next still makes my stomach turn. A group of bikers had pulled up to the intersection, their motorcycles rumbling loudly as they waited for the light to change. Most wore leather vests covered in patches, though none that I recognized as belonging to any of the more respected motorcycle clubs. These guys seemed different. Trouble, my father would have called them. One of them, a heavy-set man with a scraggly beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, revved his engine loudly, causing Thomas to turn his head slightly toward the sound. The biker laughed and said something to his friends that I couldn't hear over the noise of the traffic. Whatever it was made them all laugh. The light changed and the crosswalk signal began to chirp. Thomas, hearing this, started to step forward, his cane sweeping in an arc in front of him. He'd barely made it 2 steps when the heavy-set biker suddenly accelerated forward, deliberately swerving toward Thomas. In a moment that seemed to unfold in slow motion, the biker extended his boot and kicked Thomas's cane with enough force to send it flying from his grip. The white cane clattered across the pavement, well out of Thomas's reach. "Watch where you're going, old man," the biker yelled over his shoulder as his friends roared with laughter and sped after him. Thomas froze in the middle of the crosswalk, suddenly disoriented without his navigational aid. Cars started honking as the light changed. I could see panic washing over his face as he stood there, arms slightly extended, trying to orient himself in what must have felt like a chaotic void of sound and danger. I was already on my feet, my half-eaten lunch forgotten as I rushed toward the crosswalk to help. But someone else got there first. A young woman in workout clothes. Later, I'd learn her name was Melissa Chen, a physical therapist at the local hospital. Had seen what happened and sprinted into the street. She gently took Thomas's arm, retrieved his cane, and guided him safely to the other side while shooting daggers with her eyes at the retreating bikers. I arrived just as they reached the sidewalk. "Those worthless." "Right," Thomas was saying, his voice shaking not with fear, but with a controlled rage that seemed to radiate from him. "If I could still see, I'd teach them some respect." "Are you hurt, sir?" Melissa asked, checking him over with professional efficiency. "Only my pride," Thomas replied, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you for your help, young lady. Not everyone would step into traffic for a stranger." I introduced myself and asked if there was anything else we could do to help. Thomas assured us he was fine and insisted on continuing to his appointment at the VA clinic just 2 blocks away. After making sure he was truly okay, Melissa reluctantly left for her shift at the hospital. "I can walk with you to the VA if you'd like," I offered, still concerned. Thomas smiled in my general direction. "I appreciate it, but I've been navigating this route for 15 years. One encounter with an idiot isn't going to throw me off course." His resilience was impressive, but I noticed his hand was gripping his cane so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Just as Thomas was about to continue on his way, a deep voice called out from behind us. "Master Sergeant Reeves? Is that you, sir?" We both turned toward the voice. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 30s was jogging across the street toward us. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, but everything from his high and tight haircut to his ramrod-straight posture screamed military. "Who's asking?" Thomas replied cautiously. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, sir, 82nd Airborne." "You probably don't remember me, but you spoke at my basic training graduation at Fort Benning back in 2010. Changed my whole perspective on service." Thomas's face transformed, a genuine smile replacing his guarded expression. "Washington? Of course I remember. You asked the best damn question during the Q&A. Wanted to know if I thought the sacrifice was worth it." He extended his hand, which Washington shook with obvious respect. "What happened here?" Washington asked, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the crosswalk. "I saw some commotion from down the block." Before I could intervene, Thomas explained what had occurred with the bikers. As he spoke, I watched Washington's expression harden, a muscle working in his jaw. "They went that way," Thomas added, gesturing vaguely in the direction the motorcycles had headed. "But don't worry about it, son. Not worth your time." Washington checked his watch. "Actually, sir, I've got some time. I'm meeting some battle buddies for lunch at McPherson's in 20 minutes. Do you mind if I make a quick call?" Without waiting for a response, Washington stepped away and pulled out his phone. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I caught fragments. "Master Sergeant from Nam." Some bikers thought it would be funny. "Yes, sir. Heading toward the Rusty Nail. Looked like." When he returned, Washington offered to walk with Thomas to his appointment. This time, Thomas accepted. As they prepared to leave, Washington turned to me. "Thanks for stepping up," he said, extending his hand. "Too many people would have just watched." "I wish I'd been faster," I admitted. "You were moving when it counted," Thomas assured me. "That's what matters." As they walked away, I heard Thomas ask Washington about his service, and the younger man's animated response faded as they moved down the sidewalk. I returned to the cafe to pay my bill, but I couldn't shake the image of Thomas standing helpless in that crosswalk, or the callous laughter of the bikers as they sped away. I decided to follow the same route to McPherson's pub, a popular watering hole for off-duty military personnel that served the best wings in 3 counties. I wasn't sure what Washington was planning, but something told me I wanted to be nearby when it happened. McPherson's was only a few blocks away, occupying the corner of a historic brick building with large windows overlooking the street. I found a seat at the bar, with a clear view outside, and ordered a soda, settling in to wait for whatever might unfold. About 15 minutes later, I spotted the same group of bikers pulling into the parking lot of the Rusty Nail, a dive bar directly across the street known for cheap beer and questionable clientele. The 5 men dismounted, laughing and shoving each other as they headed toward the entrance. The heavy-set one who had kicked Thomas's cane was leading the pack, gesturing broadly as he apparently recounted some story to his friends. I felt a flash of anger watching them, so carefree after what they'd done. What kind of person deliberately targets a blind elderly veteran? The thought made my stomach turn. Another 15 minutes passed. I was beginning to think nothing would happen when I noticed a convoy of 3 personal vehicles pull up outside McPherson's. The first was a lifted Jeep Wrangler Rubicon with US Army decals on the windshield. Behind it was a Ford F-250 Super Duty that had seen better days, and bringing up the rear was the vehicle that made me sit up straight. A desert tan Humvee with civilian plates. The vehicles parked, and 8 men and 2 women emerged, all with the unmistakable bearing of active-duty military. None were in uniform, but they moved with the coordinated precision of people accustomed to operating as a unit. Washington was among them, now wearing a black 82nd Airborne Division ball cap. They gathered briefly on the sidewalk. Though I couldn't hear them, it appeared Washington was giving instructions. The group nodded, and then, as one, they crossed the street toward the Rusty Nail. I found myself holding my breath as they disappeared inside. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. 5 minutes? 10. The bartender asked if I wanted another soda, and I nodded distractedly, my eyes never leaving the door of the dive bar. 15 minutes after the group had entered, the door to the Rusty Nail burst open. The bikers emerged, but gone was their swagger from earlier. They moved quickly, almost scurrying to their motorcycles. Their faces were pale, and the heavy-set one was actually trembling as he fumbled with his keys. Behind them came Washington and his friends, who stood in a line at the entrance, arms crossed, watching silently as the bikers prepared to leave. No one was shouting, no one was making threats. They were just watching. And somehow, that silent observation seemed more intimidating than any verbal confrontation could have been. The bikers started their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life. As they began to pull away, the door to the Rusty Nail opened once more, and an older man emerged, tall, with steel-gray hair, and the weathered face of someone who had seen combat. He said something to Washington, who immediately pulled out his phone. The bikers were just turning onto the main road when the tan Humvee suddenly roared to life. With surprising speed for such a bulky vehicle, it pulled out of its parking spot and accelerated down the street. The screeching of its tires echoed between the buildings as it cut across traffic, causing cars to honk and swerve. The Humvee caught up to the bikers at the next intersection and swerved in front of them, forcing them to brake hard or crash. The heavy-set biker wobbled dangerously before regaining control of his motorcycle, almost laying it down on the pavement in his effort to stop. The driver's door of the Humvee flew open, and a mountain of a man unfolded himself from behind the wheel. He must have been 6'5" at least, with shoulders that strained the seams of his tight black t-shirt. A faded Force Recon tattoo was visible on one massive bicep. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he approached the lead biker. By now, Washington and the others had caught up, forming a loose semicircle around the bikers, who were looking increasingly nervous. Traffic had slowed to a crawl as drivers rubbernecked at the confrontation unfolding at the intersection. I couldn't hear the exchange from my vantage point, but I didn't need to. The body language told the story clearly enough. The huge Force Recon Marine did most of the talking, occasionally pointing back in the direction they had come from. The biker's postures became increasingly submissive, with the heavyset one nodding repeatedly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the Marine stepped back and crossed his arms. The bikers turned their motorcycles around and, followed closely by the Humvee, headed back the way they had come. Curious, I paid my tab and followed at a discreet distance. To my surprise, the procession led straight to the VA clinic, the very place Thomas had been heading earlier. The bikers parked their motorcycles in the visitor's lot, and the Humvee pulled up behind them, effectively blocking any potential escape. Washington and the others arrived a moment later in their vehicles. The Marine gestured toward the entrance, and with obvious reluctance, the bikers trudged inside, surrounded by their military escort. I hesitated, then decided to follow. Inside the clinic's lobby, I found an extraordinary scene unfolding. Thomas Reeves was seated in a chair near the reception desk, apparently having just finished his appointment. The bikers were lined up in front of him, looking like schoolboys called to the principal's office. The heavyset one was directly in front of Thomas, his eyes fixed on the floor. The Marine stood behind Thomas, a hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. Washington and another man, the older one with gray hair I'd seen exit the Rusty Nail, flanked Thomas on either side. "Say it again," the Marine growled, "so the Master Sergeant can hear you clearly." The heavyset biker swallowed hard. I'm sorry for what I did, sir. It was disrespectful and cruel. There's no excuse for my behavior." Thomas's face remained impassive, his sightless eyes hidden behind dark glasses. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, raising his white cane slightly. The biker nodded, then realizing Thomas couldn't see the gesture, mumbled, "Yes, sir." "This isn't just a stick," Thomas continued, his voice steady. "For me, this is independence. This is dignity. When you kicked it away, you weren't just being a bully. You were taking my freedom." The biker's face reddened with shame. "I understand, sir. I wasn't thinking. I was just showing off for my friends and save the excuses," the gray-haired man cut in. I would later learn he was Colonel James Barrett, retired, a former commander who had served with Thomas in Vietnam. "Master Sergeant Reeves doesn't need to hear why you thought it was okay to target a blind veteran. He deserves your apology and your guarantee that nothing like this will ever happen again." "Yes, sir," the biker said quickly. "You have my word." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the handle of his cane. Finally, he spoke. "I accept your apology," he said. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I choose not to carry the weight of anger. That's something I learned in Vietnam. Hate only destroys the vessel that contains it." He leaned forward slightly. "But understand this. I may be blind, but I am not alone. I never have been, not since the day I put on the uniform. The Brotherhood of Arms doesn't end when the service does." "No, sir, it doesn't," Washington agreed, his voice firm. Thomas gestured toward the men and women surrounding him. "These folks, they're just a tiny fraction of my extended family. We look out for each other. We always have, and we always will." The biker nodded miserably. "I understand, sir." "Good," Thomas replied. "Then we're done here." But the Marine wasn't quite satisfied. He stepped forward, towering over the biker. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "The Master Sergeant needs a ride home after his appointment. His regular driver couldn't make it today." The biker looked confused. "You want us to—" "I want you," the Marine clarified, poking a finger into the biker's chest, "to give the Master Sergeant a ride home on your motorcycle. Show him the respect of delivering him safely to his door." The biker's eyes widened. "But he's blind?" Thomas finished for him, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Yes, I am. But I've ridden plenty of motorcycles in my day. I'll ride on the back, arms around your waist, just like any passenger would. Unless you don't think you can handle the responsibility." For the first time, I saw something other than fear or shame in the biker's expression. A flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect. "I can handle it, sir," he said. "I'll get you home safely. You have my word." And that's exactly what happened. I watched from the parking lot as Thomas was helped onto the back of the biker's motorcycle. He settled himself comfortably, wrapping his arms around the heavy-set man's waist. The Marine gave the biker precise directions to Thomas's home, along with a warning that left no room for misinterpretation about what would happen if Thomas arrived with so much as a hair out of place. The unlikely pair departed, followed at a respectful distance by the Humvee and Washington in his Jeep, an escort to ensure the journey went smoothly. Later that evening, I received a call from Washington, who had taken my number before leaving the VA clinic. He invited me to join them at McPherson's, where Thomas was holding court at a corner table, recounting tales from his service days to an attentive audience of active duty personnel. When I arrived, Thomas greeted me warmly, insisting I take the seat beside him. "I hear you were the first one moving to help," he said. "That means something." "Not fast enough," I admitted. "I should have—" "None of that," Thomas interrupted. "In my experience, most people freeze when they witness something shocking. The fact that you moved at all puts you ahead of 90% of the population." As the evening progressed, I learned more about Thomas's story. His childhood in rural Georgia, his draft notice in 1968, the friends he'd lost in the jungles of Vietnam, and his decades of service before retiring as a master sergeant. He spoke about losing his sight, the depression that followed, and how the community of veterans had pulled him through his darkest days. "What happened to the biker?" I asked during a lull in the conversation. "After he dropped you off?" Thomas chuckled. "Jason? He actually came inside, accepted my offer of coffee, and we talked for nearly an hour." His expression grew more serious. "Turns out he's a troubled kid with a chip on his shoulder. Father was abusive. Mother left when he was young. He never had anyone to teach him respect or responsibility." "That doesn't excuse what he did," Washington pointed out. "No, it doesn't," Thomas agreed. "But it helps explain it. And here's the interesting part. When he was leaving, he asked if he could come back sometime. Maybe help with some yard work I've been putting off." "And what did you say?" I asked, fascinated by this unexpected turn. Thomas smiled. "I told him my lawn needs mowing every 2 weeks, and my gutters haven't been cleaned in a year." He tapped his cane on the floor for emphasis. Sometimes, what troubled souls need most isn't punishment, but purpose. A chance to make amends in a meaningful way. The Marine, whose name was Derek Sullivan, raised his glass. "To second chances," he said, "and to brotherhood that never dies." "To brotherhood," everyone echoed, glasses raised. As I looked around that table at the faces of men and women spanning 3 generations of military service, I understood something profound about the bonds formed in service to one's country. These weren't just former colleagues or people who had shared similar experiences. They were family in the truest sense of the word. What had begun as an act of cruelty had revealed something beautiful. The unbreakable connection between those who have served. A reminder that no veteran ever truly fights alone. 3 months later, I drove past Thomas's house and saw a now familiar motorcycle parked in the driveway. Jason, the former biker villain of our story, was on a ladder, replacing rotted wood on Thomas's front porch while Thomas sat in a rocking chair below, offering instructions with surprising precision for someone who couldn't see. I slowed down, considering whether to stop, when Thomas raised his hand in a wave, somehow sensing my presence. I waved back, forgetting momentarily about his blindness, then honked my horn gently in greeting before driving on. In my rearview mirror, I could see Jason climbing down from the ladder to describe to Thomas who had driven by. and I realized that sometimes the most powerful form of justice isn't punishment, but transformation. The kind that can only come from understanding, forgiveness, and the opportunity to make things right. That encounter changed not just Jason's life, but mine as well. It showed me the extraordinary power of the bonds forged through military service, bonds that don't break with time or distance. The veteran community looks after their own with a fierce loyalty that most civilians like me can barely comprehend. If this story touched you, please take a moment to subscribe to Honor Echoes. Each week, we bring you true stories of veterans whose courage, sacrifice, and humanity remind us of what truly matters. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community dedicated to honoring those who've served. And remember, behind every veteran is a story of courage that deserves to be told. Until next time, this is Honor Echoes, where service never ends and every veteran's voice echoes through time.